All right, section 16.3 deals with systematics, and as defined in your book, that's the field of biology dedicated to understanding the evolutionary history of all life on Earth. And so those scientists that are dedicated to systematics will use the fossil record, both absolute dating and relative dating. They'll also compare the form and structure between organisms to see if they're related. We know that's morphology, but you have to be careful with morphology because when you think of a bat, it looks like a bird, but it's a mammal, it's not a bird. So you have to be careful with anatomical comparison. And then the best form of data, which is most recent, would be the molecular data. So analyzing the enzymes and the relatedness between the types of enzymes between organisms, maybe running DNA fingerprinting and looking at evolutionary relatedness of the DNA fingerprint. All of that would be information that would be used by scientists in this field. Their ultimate goal then is to understand phylogeny, and phylogeny is the evolutionary relatedness of a group of organisms. So when we look at the tree of life, we're talking about like all the organisms that share a branch. And so that would be phylogeny, understanding the blue branch, understanding that yellow branch and the organisms on that branch, which ultimately leads to classification. Classification then is the identity or the identifying of all the organisms on every branch and how they're all related to each other, which we know then we can trace back down to the root at the origin of life, which would be the bacteria we studied in our chapter on evolution. So taxonomy then is the classification, identification, and naming of individual organisms. And because we speak different languages, different organisms can have common names in their country of origin that can be very different because of the differences in the language. And so a group of scientists came together, led by a particular individual, I'll get to that in a second, to come up with a way of naming organisms scientifically. And so you can have a common name like American black bear, but then also to understand and give it its scientific name using a Latin root. And so that is what taxonomy is. And in taxonomy, you have 8 different levels or names called a taxon. So here is one taxon domain. Here's the second, third, fourth, all the way down into the 8th taxon. And so in taxonomy, you're wanting to group organisms in large categories in domains and kingdoms, but eventually when you get to the species, then you're only identifying one particular type of bear. Here would be the American black bear. And so let's start at the domain. The domain is, like I said, the largest. There are 3 choices for domains, and those choices are shown here in your book. There are 2 domains that have to do with bacteria, whether you're regular bacteria or that extreme team bacteria called archaea. Every other living organism occupies the domain eukarya. So if we're, again, studying the American black bear, and we'll do the human taxonomy in just a minute, we can see that its domain name is eukarya, and that's going to include protists, and that's going to include fungi, that's going to include plants. So now when we get to the kingdom name, now we've just identified the animal kingdom. Remember, you just did a kingdoms chart and you told me that there are 6 kingdoms on our planet. And so the American black bear is a member of the Animalia kingdom, just like you and me. For the phylum name, now we're going to begin to look at just animals that have a backbone. So Chordata is the phylum name. The class name then is Mammalia, because we're not talking about organisms that have feathers, and we're not talking about organisms with scales that lay eggs. We're talking about mammals that have hair and are warm-blooded. Within the Mammalia class, then, are different kinds of mammals. And so the American black bear is a member of the order Carnivora. That's where we would no longer share any more of the taxon names with the American black bear. So you and I are Eukarya, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia. But once you get to the order in a moment, you'll see that we are not carnivora. Carnivora are animals with specific teeth patterns that eat meat. Then we can see the family name would be Ursidae, which would be any kind of bear, polar bear, panda bear, black bear, brown bear. Then we can see the genus name is Ursus, and that would be a particular type of large bear. And then finally, we can see the species name is Americanus. And so the scientific name for the American black bear being its common name, the scientific name would be Ursus americanus. If we look at our taxonomy as human beings, again, we are Eukarya domain. It doesn't happen to be on this table. You are Animalia, you are Chordata, you are Mammalia, but we are not carnivora like the black bear. We are primates. Remember when we talked about evolution and how we share a branch with primates? We are hominids. That means we're not the weird-looking lemurs. We are the man-looking primates. We are, our genus name is Homo, having to do with wise. Having to do with man. So that has to do with the upright bipedal types of primates. So that takes away the great apes. And then our species name is sapiens. Sapiens means wise. So Homo is man, sapiens is wise. So on my birth certificate, I had a first, a middle, and a last name that was my official legal name. If I were to write my official scientific name as a human being, then there would be 8 names: Eukarya, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, primates, Hominidae, Homo sapiens. If we look over here at the example from your book, it's showing you this type of flowering plant. It is Eukarya. It is not an animal, it's a plant. And so its phylum name, class name, order, family, genus, and then species name would be unique to the fact that it is a plant. So we don't share any of our scientific names except for Eukarya with this particular plant. And so I was mentioning to you earlier that scientists came together and agreed that scientific names should be Latin, and they should not focus on the common name. And so Carolus Linnaeus, Carl is what he was also known. Sometimes some books will say Carolus, which was his official first name, but we'll go with Carl. Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s came up with the taxon naming system. He came up with the 8 different taxons. Collectively, 8 taxons are called taxa. So he came up with the 8 taxa naming system. And in order to make things a whole lot simpler than rattling off your 8 scientific names, he came up with a concept called binomial nomenclature. In binomial nomenclature, for the scientific name, you can go with just the genus and species in order to shorten the name. So I have 4 legal names, but for most of the time when I introduce myself for the first time, I just use 2. Hi, I'm Lisa Keene. Or if it's super casual, hey, I'm Lisa. And so when it comes to the scientific names, you don't have to rattle off all 8 taxa. You can just take it down to its binomial nomenclature, which means that you would describe that organism by giving its genus and species name. And so the common name of the example, cypress. Did I spell cypress wrong? They gave an example in the book about a particular type of fish. Some people in America call it a bowfish, or bowfin. Some call it a grindle. Some call it the cypress trout. But if we all in the scientific community want to recognize its official scientific name, it's Amia calva. And you always capitalize the genus and lowercase the species. If you're typing it, you italicize it. If you are not, you underline it. If you are writing it, you underline it. And you could even go as casual as just calling it A. calvia. So we've talked about the gut bacteria, the stuff that's found in your intestines that makes you healthy. Its scientific name is Escherichia coli, but you probably know it more, probably recognize it more as E. coli. So you can actually even shorten the binomial nomenclature. So our scientific name is Homo sapien. I'm going to underline that. I'm going to make sure that my genus is capitalized and that my species is lowercase. And you could even go as casual as saying H. sapien. So when individuals who study systematics and phylogeny and classification want to show evolutionary relatedness, they can use two different devices. The one on the left is called a phylogenetic tree. And so just like the ones we've studied before in the past, you can see that the organism at the bottom would be a founding common ancestor. Here we can see of these four different kinds of animals, the Bovidae do not have antlers and the Cervidae do. So we can see where they branch apart. So we can see their relatedness to a common ancestor, but then we can see where they branch apart. And then if we go a little bit further, we can see that the domesticated sheep and the domesticated cattle, they also branched away from each other. And we can see that the red deer and the reindeer, while they share common ancestors and common traits, they are their own species. And so that's what a phylogenetic tree does. Now, a cladogram does the exact same thing. A cladogram tells you about different categories of organisms, but a cladogram also tells you which evolved earliest and which evolved latest. But the cool thing about a cladogram is a cladogram also gives you a reason why the branching occurred. There are no reasons here. We just had to kind of look at the pictures. And I read in your book that Bovidae do not have antlers and Cervidae do. But on a cladogram, it would actually tell you what it was in the evolutionary pattern of that organism that made it branch the way it did. And then we can see that snakes and lizards are closely related with a common ancestor. Unfortunately, they don't give the common ancestor here. But we could find that in a database, or we could find that on a really detailed tree of life. Okay, that's it.